It's really important to, I think, measure attitudes towards gendered relationships whenever we talk about pronatalism, because it is really inextricably linked with attitudes about race and religion, but also attitudes about gender.
Welcome, everyone. I'm happy to be talking today with Sam Perry. He's a professor of sociology at the University of Oklahoma. He's one of the nation's foremost experts on Christian nationalism. And perhaps most importantly, he is a PRI affiliated scholar. And so, in that context, we're going to be talking today about his fantastic new article that just was e-published by the Journal for the Scientific Study of Religion, the JSSR, called The Right Kind of Children: Christian Nationalism, Religiosity, and Support for Selective versus General Pronatalism. So, Sam, welcome today. Tell us a little bit about maybe before we talk about the findings in the piece, can you maybe talk a little bit about what pronatalism is and why Christian nationalists are preoccupied perhaps with this concept?
Sure. So pronatalism has become a hot button topic in the media, and especially on the American right. And there seems to be like this, I think, I don't go a few days without seeing a new headline, either in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal, about interest in pronatalism and increasing American birth rate. So pronatalism is a belief, broadly speaking, that Americans should, or our group should, have more children, and in some cases as many children as possible. So this idea of pronatalism has become mainstream. It used to be kind of fringe. People think of like the Duggars and quiverful movements and fundamentalist Christians from the 1980s and 90s, but it's actually become a more common part of mainstream discourse. What's interesting, though, is I think the media has seized upon really prominent pronatalists that tend to be more secular, like Elon Musk and Mark Andreessen and Vivek Ramaswamy. They've all made comments. Public figures like Donald Trump has called himself the fertilization president, and J.D. Vance has also talked about wanting to increase American birth rates. So people have looked at this broad swath of American leaders getting involved in pronatalism, and I think the assumption, it is a mistaken assumption, that the movement is a lot more is a lot more big tent than it really is. And in fact, we've found in previous studies that the leading predictor that you're concerned about American birth rates is that you are a culture warring Christian, that you are a somebody who is not just conservative, but somebody who is like a religious conservative, those two things combined. And so that really got me interested in Christian nationalism, this ideology that sees a fusion of American civic life with Christianity and its relationship with pronatalist attitudes. In previous studies, we found that Christian nationalism seems to incline Americans toward what I would call a group-centered pronatalism. That it is about not just babies for their own sake, but it's about more babies, our kind of babies, more babies for our nation, for our religious group, for our racial group, or for our political group, more than just more children would be better.
So, what was it about the American Values Survey from last fall that you found particularly compelling? And you wanted to write this new article. So, tell us a little bit about what's unique about the data.
Yeah, so PRI is always collecting fantastic data on a variety of different political subjects. And so every time I get a new look at the kind of things that PRI is collecting, I always want to dive in to see, okay, are there some new measures that are worth exploring further here? Christian nationalism is captured so well by PRI data that I think I always want to check out and see how are those measures corresponding with the kind of new political questions that we have. So in the 2025 AVS, PRI asked Americans how much they agreed or supported the idea that either the government should promote policies that encourage more people to have children, what you might call general pronatalism, or it should promote policies that encourage only certain Americans to have children to preserve a demographic status quo. And so really it's an experiment, because those were the only questions that were changed, or the wording that was changed slightly. You can imagine me in a lab coat just adding, with beakers, adding this and taking away that. It's if we can see that Americans responded differently to those questions, we can say, oh, okay, it's about the framing of the question. And so what I found is that religion seemed to predict those two outcomes in different ways. So traditional religious commitment, so like going to church, seemed to correspond really strongly to the idea that the government should promote general pronatalism, that it would be great if if a policy came around that Americans could have more children. Maybe because there's some connection between just traditionalist religiosity and the idea that children are a gift or a blessing and that more would be better. But Christian nationalism corresponded to the idea, oh, and not the general pronatalism, but only the specific or selective pronatalism, that there should be a policy that encourages only certain Americans to have children to preserve a demographic status quo. Not only was Christian nationalism associated with that outcome, but belief in replacement theory was also associated with that. The idea that immigrants are coming in and taking are changing our cultural and ethnic heritage. And also something that I measured called insecure masculinity was a strong predictor of that outcome as well.
Can you talk a little bit about that measure? I wish I'd come up with the term insecure masculinity because I really think it encapsulates a lot of what we're seeing on the far right. You found, in fact, that insecure masculinity, easy to say, contributed to significantly to both general pronatalism and the more selective pronatalism. So, talk a little bit about that measure and what you think we're finding with that. What is that tapping into?
Right. It's really important to, I think, measure attitudes towards gendered relationships whenever we talk about pronatalism, because it is really inextricably linked with attitudes about race and religion, but also attitudes about gender. And so insecure masculinity is an index that I just made from the great questions that PRI had in this survey that were are how much you agree with questions like our society is becoming too soft and feminine. The gains that women have experienced in recent years have come at the expense of men. And that young men are struggling to find their place in the world these days more than young women are. That to me, I called it insecure masculinity because we have these great measures that we call like hostile sexism or patriarchal gender roles. The questions that PRI used this time seem to evoke the idea of men losing ground, young men especially, but men losing ground in society and society changing in a way that is somehow disadvantaging men. They are maybe not hostile or misogynistic toward women, but they feel like their place is slipping and they want to get some of that back. And yes, I found that index was strongly predictive of both of those outcomes, both the general pronatalist policy and the selective pronatalist policy. I think to me that suggests that the idea that we should have more children is a gendered view. That not just that we should have more children, but that the government should promote us having more children through policy, either general or selective. And I think that is largely because the idea that we should have policies that encourage more people to have children in fact policies that would require gender changes. Every book, every article that mentions us having more kids as a nation seems to imply or explicitly requires that women walk back their gains in the workforce, that they don't go to school, they don't go to college, that they don't pursue careers that they voluntarily, or perhaps to some degree involuntarily, stay home. They get married earlier and they start having babies for the nation, for the religion, for their people group, and that kind of thing. That's been taking place in countries all over the world, that kind of policy agenda. And in the United States, this is, I think, what is a little bit more concerning. Certainly, we see the policies that have been trotted out by groups like the Heritage Foundation or even on the Republican Party, not just about having babies because we want to stave off immigration, which is a part of that as well, and not just because we want to reproduce American culture, whatever that looks like, but we want to return to a particular kind of gendered order. One that sees men going out and winning bread for their family, bringing home the bacon, and women voluntarily and happily staying home and being mothers for the nation. Historically, that's there's been a lot of movements that have also tried to do those kind of things, and they're frankly rather horrifying to be associated with. And yet we seem to be moving towards that idea. And this is why Christian nationalism is an important part of this conversation as well, because Christian nationalism is really an ideology that also undergirds traditionalist gender roles or insecure masculinity, replacement theory, all those kinds of things. So all of this stuff is bound in together.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And one of the things about I think the general pronatalism question. So I should also say to the audience, if you look nationally, very few Americans really endorse selective pronatalism, right? So that's, I think, important to kind of bear in mind. I think it's fewer than 10% of Americans more generally. Your work, of course, shows that if you have Christian nationalist views if you you have insecure masculine views, if you believe in the great replacement theory, there is a statistical connection there.
Right.
But on the more general question, I think it's really telling that, by basically almost 2 to 1, if you look at young people in particular, young men, about half support this kind of policy, whereas fewer than half of young women, basically around half, I mean, rather about 30%, fewer than 30% of young women endorse that. And so it's really speaking to the fact that a lot of young women are sort of rejecting those kinds of orders. And it's, of course, then leading, I think, many conservative groups to essentially promote these kinds of policies, right? Or to promote trad wife content online,
Right.
because essentially younger women aren't accepting that. And that's very challenging to the worldview of a lot of these folks. And it also speaks, I think, to something you said earlier. I do think, and this is something that Richard Reeves talks about, he is the founder of the American Institute for Boys and Men, that for young women, and I can say this as someone who's written a book that really looks at gender and Gen Z and political activism, we've given young women lots of different options about what their career paths can be, promoted them as leaders, told them they can kind of reach for the stars, do all these sorts of things. And I think the measure of success for a lot of men still is, I need to be a provider, I need to be a father. And so that kind of, I think, that long held kind of idea, I think really shows us why men tend to be more supportive of these policies, even younger men today, which I think is really something interesting and that we need to be watching and unpacking. So last thing I want to say is this is very much in the weeds, and maybe this is for the folks who are the true social scientists, but there is a triple interaction going on in some of your statistical analysis. And so we don't want to get into the stats involved per se, but essentially, what do you find with respect to religiosity and the selective pronatalism policy? Because I think that's really an interesting point that we should bring to light a little bit. Like maybe in layman's term, what did you find with respect to religiosity and selective pronatalism?
Right. So this is really important to keep in mind because once again, we found that traditional religious commitment, church attendance is associated with the support for a general pronatalist policy, Christian nationalism with the selective pronatalist policy. But when I tried to slice it a little bit thinner and to see, okay, is it all Christian nationalists who are inclined to support this kind of selective pronatalism, or is it people who are more or less religious? This is important because I wonder if people affirm Christian nationalism for all kinds of reasons, and sometimes it just means our way of life, our culture, people like us, and it's very what we might call ethno-traditionalism. It's not about the religiosity per se; it's more about like, no, it's our kind of people, people like us, and so what I found is I found that the Christian nationalists who are the most in support of this selective pronatalism are those who attend church the least. In other words, it's the people who are the most they're Christian nationalists, but they're disconnected from traditional religious commitment. I think that suggests to me that this is more about that ethno-traditionalism. It is about a desire to preserve a demographic status quo, not just to promote our religious group, but white Americans, Anglo-Protestants, people who we feel like are the ones who truly belong in this nation. And which is I think, consistent with what we might expect when we look at these kinds of movements historically. I'm not suggesting that pronatalists that should be lumped in with really right-wing fascist or Nazi kind of movements. I don't mean that. People can want babies for all kinds of reasons, and I think, are legitimate bipartisan reasons to be concerned about what declining birth rates mean for the nation. And yet, when we look at the survey data, we find that the Americans most enthusiastic about the kind of policy that would promote certain Americans having more children to preserve the demographic makeup of the country are those who are disconnected from religion but strong Christian nationalists. So they want a return to a traditional way of life, a traditional kind of nation. And I think that is worrying for a variety of reasons.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for walking us through this great new article. I really recommend folks go and take a look at it online, and of course, follow our work here at PRI. So thank you, thanks again, Sam, and everyone have a great day. Thank you.